let me go to my notes. Let me just cover premillennialism. And I've got 5 minutes to at least, I've done this. I've done this with you before. Postmillennialism, amillennialism. Remember how you interpret the 6 usages of the 1,000 years in Revelation 1-7 influences your understanding of half the Bible. Because 39 of the 66 books are about which ethnic group? The Jews, and their history, and their promises, and their unconditional covenants. Forever and ever. Unless God doesn't mean forever. And how my Anglican, Catholic, Presbyterian friends get around that is when Jesus said, I came to fulfill the law, they meant Jesus came to fulfill every covenant promised to Israel. And he fulfilled them all, so now Israel's gone. The Jewish people are gone. And that's why Tucker Carlson will go on TV and say he despises evangelical dispensational Christians. But if you look at Tucker Carlson 20 years ago, he's talking about how important the Jewish people. And then how do all the kings in the Gulf states feel about a democratically elected Iran? How soon before their heads are on the chopping block? Think the wars of 1848 in Europe, where all the kings and queens were falling. Think Louis XVI. When you get one democratically elected government, it's hard for all the other kings to stay on the throne. Okay, amillennialism, number 2 on your sheet there, says that the 1,000 years is pretty purely symbolic. So postmillennialism says Jesus is coming back at the end of the millennium, and we live in it now, hence post. Believe it or not, this is the best it's going to be on planet Earth. Yowzer doodleberries. Satan is bound. Satan is bound right now. That's why Hal Lindsey wrote a book in the 70s, Satan is Alive and Well on Planet Earth, to push back on this nut job of an idea. That Satan is bound and we're living in the millennium. Okay? That's postmillennialism. Amillennialism says it's just purely symbolic. So here's the kicker, though. They don't believe that Christ's return is symbolic, the second coming. They don't believe that the battle at the end of time with Satan is symbolic. So everything else in the context is real, except 1,000 years, and that's symbolic. Now, how do you get to that? Well, we just want to sprinkle babies. And if there's a future for Jewish Israel, then we're not the covenant people, and we should be immersing believers and not sprinkling babies, because sprinkling babies brings you into the covenant of Israel, because it's the New Testament version of circumcision. So everything else in the passage is literal, except 1,000 years is completely symbolic. Kevin, go ahead.
Just 2 things. First off, the Lutherans don't believe in what you just said. It's the Presbyterians that believe it's the covenant.
Yes. You're correct. Yeah.
And secondly,
trying to get all the different nitnoid details within that framework is, go ahead.
And then also, some Lutherans, my sister's still a Lutheran. I was raised in a Lutheran.
Yep.
I was going to be a Lutheran pastor, so that's why. But they believe, as far as Satan, that they're amillennialists.
Yes.
But they're still clinging to the fact that Satan is bound.
Yes.
So they're kind of combining the two.
Correct. The Catholic Church is straight up amillennialist because they have, the first 300 years of Christianity didn't believe this, but Augustine is the one that really, how do we get a church state together, and how do we get sprinkling? Because I wasn't sprinkled as a baby, even though my mom was a godly believer. How do I, and he's a lawyer, and so he explains how that the church has replaced Israel. Interesting, isn't it, Kevin, that Luther is an Augustinian monk. I've said this to you before, but Luther didn't want to restore the early church where we would say the Bible is the sole source for faith and practice. Luther was not trying to get to the epistles and the book of Acts. He wanted to take the church back to Augustine, and Augustine lives 400 years after Jesus. He's an Augustine. Now, I think you can make a good case that Augustine understood salvation by faith alone. And he threw a lot of other stuff in it, and it just depends. Are you reading Augustine? When in Augustine's life are you reading him? Because he seems to play both sides against the middle on a lot of topics through his life. But remember, Luther was not trying to get back to the church of Irenaeus or Polycarp or Justin Martyr. That's not the church he wanted to get back to, the 1st and 2nd century pastors. No, he wanted to go back to Augustine. Kevin, go ahead.
Just one last thing.
Yeah.
When Luther said, by faith alone, faith in what?
Yes.
Faith in baptism. faith in communion.
Yes.
That was the faith. It's hard faith.
So what's interesting is that Luther and Zwingli, so our view of the Lord's Supper is a Zwinglian view, symbolic. They tried to get together because Luther lives in Germany, Zwingli lives in northern Switzerland, and they couldn't come to an agreement because Luther wanted to believe the Lord's Supper is consubstantiation, not trans, so it doesn't become the literal body and blood of Christ, but it's the most confusing view of the Lord's Supper as far as I'm concerned. Transubstantiation is it just becomes the body and blood. That's Catholic. The Baptist view or Zwingli's view is it's purely symbol. This view is Christ is around, under, through, and there's a level of grace. I mean, it's mind-numbing to try to understand what Luther is saying, okay? So I know I need to just talk through amillennialism really quick. So this is a spiritual reign. Amil replaces Israel with the church, adopts infant sprinkling as the covenant symbol instead of circumcision, and believes Christ's fulfillment of the law means not that he never sinned, like we would say, but rather that he fulfilled all the Old Testament ceremonial law, and therefore the church is the new Israel. And I know that's a long sentence. But I didn't know where to put the period because I wanted you to get the whole train of thought, okay? God played so this means that all God's promises to ethnic Israel in Genesis to Malachi were never meant for ethnic Israel because they're also 5-point Calvinists. So, right? God planned it all. So all of his promises, everlasting covenant, everlasting covenant, everlasting covenant, only really meant until Jesus died. It didn't mean everlasting covenant. And how many times does God say ever to David, to Abraham, to Jacob, to Isaac, everlasting covenant, everlasting covenant, everlasting? It's over and over and over and over and over. But God played a nasty trick. He didn't really mean everlasting covenant. He just meant until Jesus came and you rejected the Messiah. And then I got this whole new thing I'm going to spring on you called the church. Yeah. This means that all God's promises to ethnic Israel, Genesis to Malachi, were never meant for ethnic Israel, but for the church. God played an ugly trick on the Jews. It makes God a deceiver of ethnic Israel, and especially the prophets who prophesied a future glorious Jewish kingdom. This view is truly begun with Augustine in the late 4th century and early 5th century.